There we go. Hello, time for a book review. I read this book and I highly recommend it. The Lincoln Hypothesis by Timothy Ballard. Subtitle: A modern-day abolitionist investigates the possible connection between Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon, and Abraham Lincoln. Yeah, I think now, after reading this book, I'm convinced that the American Civil War was a punishment by God against America for two national sins. One of those sins being slavery, and the other sin being persecution of religious minorities. This book goes through examples of some of the persecution that happened to Mormons. But Mormons weren't the only ones that had a hard time in the early 1800s. Catholics received a lot of persecution. Jews at that time received a lot of persecution in America. And before I read this book, I thought about the connection or link between those two things before. One of the reasons that the Mormons were so hated was that Mormons were anti-slavery. We still are. We didn't switch and now we're for slavery. We were anti-slavery in the 1800s. Let's see. Examples, connections. Yes. So Joseph Smith ran for the presidency. I knew that before I read this book. Timothy Ballard made an extremely convincing case that most, if not all, of Joseph Smith's platform when he was running for president was based on eternal truths and revelations. Joseph Smith was trying to save America from suffering the Civil War. And maybe the Civil War would have been averted if he would have won the presidency. Or if whoever won the presidency in the 1840s would have implemented his idea about banning slavery and having the federal government enforce our constitutional rights. Before I read this book, I don't remember ever reading the specific fact that he cited that when the debate was going on about what the Bill of Rights would be, I think it was James Madison, definitely one of the founding fathers, proposed different wording, or a whole new amendment or different wording for the amendments that were put together that would give the national government authority to enforce people's civil rights. And the gentleman who made that proposal prophesied of a civil war if the amendment didn't go through. And Joseph Smith, his reason for, well, one example of the persecution, immoral persecution that happened in the 1800s was Mormons were chased out of Missouri. Some of them killed, some of them raped, all their property that they couldn't carry on their backs stolen from them. And when Joseph Smith talked to the President of the United States at that time about it, he said something like, "I'd like to help you, you're right, you got a good point, but I won't get reelected if I don't have that state going for me." Yeah, one common idea at the time was an extreme idea of states' rights. Now when people call for states' rights, they aren't calling for the same thing that people were calling for in the 1800s, when they wanted states to be able to enforce slavery. Back then in the 1800s, states' rights, when people argued for states' rights, they were arguing for states to be able to enforce slavery. And before I read this book, I did not realize, I hadn't read the Declaration of Independence of the Confederacy or their Constitution, but he has some quotes from that Constitution and Declaration that show that one goal of the South was slavery. That was a founding principle of the Confederated States of America. And the reason the book has the name that it has is that there are some similarities between the life of Joseph Smith and Abraham Lincoln, in that they're both born poor. Both started their lives out obscure. They're not obscure now. By the time they died, they weren't obscure, but they definitely started their lives out obscure. They both were assassinated and sealed their life's work with their own blood. And around the same time period, when Abraham Lincoln was having a big spiritual change, one of the things that it's a fact that the Civil War, if you just look at it on paper, the size of the armies, the capability of the two sides of the war, the North should have squished the South. And Timothy Ballard is convinced, and I think he made a very convincing case, that the Civil War was a punishment for the North too, because of such evil things as the Dred Scott decision. Before the Civil War, there was the Fugitive Slave Act, a national law that, while it did not legalize slavery in the free states, it did it gave government the legal authority to order people to go slave hunting, to catch runaway slaves even in the free states and return them. So Abraham Lincoln started the Civil War out not wanting to end slavery, just trying to hold things together. And most of the people in the North were thinking that way too. But he had a change. And one thing that happened in this time period when Abraham Lincoln had this change was that he checked a Book of Mormon out from the Library of Congress. And Abraham Lincoln didn't write vast journals, so we've got to do some guessing about what he was thinking and what happened. But he definitely checked the book out, and Timothy Ballard in his investigation to write this book this book that I'm talking about, went to the Library of Congress, looked at some of the Book of Mormons there that were the potential ones that Abraham Lincoln would have read, and he found one that had some dog-eared pages, and Abraham Lincoln dog-eared pages of books that he was reading when there was something important. So that book probably was one Abraham Lincoln looked at, and we can make some educated guesses about what parts of the book were poignant to him because of which pages were dog-eared. Timothy Ballard is postulating, and I'm convinced that reading the Book of Mormon helped Abraham Lincoln to understand what the right thing to do was about ending slavery and about having the 13th and 14th Amendments, about the national government having the authority to enforce the rights of religious minorities, so that people couldn't be kicked out of a state, have their property stolen like happened in Missouri to the Mormons just because they were a religious minority, maybe, and a weird religion. One other thing that this book helped me to do was learn more about Seward. the same guy who helped us get Alaska, which at the time was called Seward's Folly, but now we know how good Alaska is for America to have. Not just because of the good governors and the good congressmen that we get out of it. Seward was, before reading this book, I knew that Seward was the one who was, at the beginning of 1860, expected to win the presidency, to win the nomination for the Republican Party and become president. He did not get that, but he ended up being in Abraham Lincoln's cabinet and becoming an extremely close friend and advisor to President Lincoln. And when they assassinated Abraham Lincoln, they attempted to assassinate Seward that same day and hurt him real bad, but he ended up surviving for several years after. But one of Seward's sons died that day, and his wife didn't die of wounds that day, but she died extremely soon after the assassination attempt because of the stress and emotional pain of losing her son and her husband being badly hurt. So I didn't realize how close of a friend and aide Seward was to Abraham Lincoln. And one thing, there are some similarities between Abraham Lincoln and Joseph Smith. One thing that Joseph Smith had was Hiram Smith, who was his older brother, who was an extremely close advisor and friend, who was martyred the same day Joseph Smith was martyred. Seward bears a lot of similarities, not being related that closely with Abraham Lincoln as Hiram was with Joseph Smith, but Seward bears some similarities to Hiram Smith and Joseph Smith. Well, the relationship of Seward to Abraham Lincoln bears some similarities to the relationship between Hiram Smith and Joseph Smith, and that was interesting to learn. And I should have mentioned it at the start of the review. Read this book. It's a wonderful book. And one of the things that this points out, it had one quote from somebody who denounced Negroes, what was the wording they used? Whatever the wording they used in the 1800s, Negroes was the wording he used. Denounced Negroes and Mormons in the same sentence. The pro-slavery, white supremacist, black-hating people of the 1800s, they hated Mormons just as much. So have a good day. Thank you for watching this. Bye-bye.